Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and today I am joined by two very special co-hosts. We are having a crossover episode here. Please introduce yourselves, my lovely co-hosts.
I'm Mark Aldridge. We've met before, Kemper. I hope you might remember. But yes, so I've written and read and researched a lot about Agatha Christie over the years.
And you're the co-host and co-presenter.
Oh, yes. That's important.
Of the Swinging Christies, along with me, Grey Robert Brown.
And listeners, this is Kemper making an insertion from the future here as I edit this episode. But my good friend Mark Aldridge is too modest, too polite a person, apparently, to plug his book, his new book that just came out at the top of this episode. So I'm going to do it for him right now. As some of you already know, Mark wrote a book all about Miss Marple. It is called Agatha Christie's Marple, Expert on Wickedness. The book is dedicated to Catherine Brobeck, which I find extremely moving. And Catherine's dark Marple theory gets a big old shout out in the text of the book. Like all of Mark's work, it is encyclopedic and well-researched and engaging and just overall fantastic, fascinating reading. So I wholeheartedly recommend it to all of you. It is currently available to purchase in the UK, and I believe it's already available in the US as an ebook and an audiobook. As for the hard copy, it is available to pre-order in the US. It will be out shortly at the end of this month, at the end of October, just in time for Halloween here in the United States. I have included relevant links in the notes to this episode. Now is also an excellent time to give you some spoiler warnings because Mark, Gray, and I get in depth here on a lot of titles with tons of spoilers. Mainly, we stick to books from the 1960s. That will come as no surprise to listeners of the Swinging Christies, but we don't entirely stick to those books. So here is a full rundown in alphabetical order of titles spoiled to various degrees in this episode. Take heed. At Bertram's Hotel, The Body in the Library, By the Pricking of My Thumbs, A Caribbean Mystery, Cat Among the Pigeons, The Clocks, Elephants Can Remember, Endless Night, Halloween Party, Hercule Poirot's Christmas, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, Murder is Easy, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Nemesis, The Pale Horse, Passenger to Frankfurt, Postern of Fate, They Do It with Mirrors, and finally, Third Girl. That is your list of spoilers, and now back to the show.
We're so excited. Well, I'm especially excited to be here with you both because I've never been on All About Agatha before, and this is like a life goal unlocked. It's incredible. Just now when you were saying your kind of famous intro and I'm watching your lips say it as opposed to just walking around the park hearing it was quite surreal, actually. It's incredible.
It's actually very hard to do that intro and make eye contact with people also.
Yes.
It's something that I'm used to doing alone, sort of in my own cave of shame, I guess, when I'm doing the podcast. So I can understand that. But yes, Mark, of course, has been on the podcast numerous times, but never as a co-host. So let's just to be clear, you are not guests right now. You are co-hosting this episode in which we are going to do a little bit of ranking when it comes to, of course, the novels of the 1960s, which is what you two have been exploring for 10 odd episodes of the Swinging Christies.
Yeah, I'd call them odd episodes in many ways.
We're supposed to be selling our wares here, Mark. Come
in
on,
the
brilliant.
nicest possible way. Yes, so we're structurally different to you. So this is like, we were thinking we've never actually spoken about the relative merits and how much we like them because, we always feel that's an All About Agatha thing.
And we don't go book by book, we go theme by theme.
Yeah.
So, when people say the Swinging 60s, they think sex, drugs and rock and roll. And incidentally, those are three of the titles of three of our themed episodes.
Yes.
And we did talk about it at the beginning, and we were, not to embarrass you, Kemper, but it did feel like to go book by book through the 60s had been covered so beautifully and comprehensively by you and Catherine, and podcasts like Tea and Murder, which do it out of order, which is a slightly different spin and maybe offers different insights to yours.
Sure.
And then it was like, well, how can we sort of get at new observations through the 60s books? But I've got to say, my some of my favorite episodes of All About Agatha are the ranking ones, especially the one you do with John Curran, our dear friend John Curran, who I think is fair to say has different opinions to most of us about Christie in some ways. So yeah, to be chatting rankings with you is quite thrilling.
Yeah, John did the final State of the Rankings episode.
Yes.
And I don't think the rankings have really changed much since then, other than when I revisited The Secret of Chimneys. I'm not planning on changing any of the rankings after this conversation, but every time I revisit it, honestly, I feel the need to do so, or at least the urge, because it's just one of those things. And that's very sweet of you that, you know, you're acting as if All About Agatha owns the concept of ranking. But I appreciate that you held off until this episode. And I should just mention, we are doing this in person, which is very much not the All About Agatha way, but it is a Swinging Christie's way. And it's lovely to be able to do this here in Torquay on Agatha Christie's birthday.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, honestly, yeah. To be sat here with, I think it's fair to say, the two people that have done more for Agatha Christie fandom than anyone else living, you know, on Christie's birthday in Christie's hometown.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, but it's a very nice thing to say.
No, it's true. Honestly, it's true. It's true.
Just starting with all the flattery. Well, I did a little bit of preparation, just a little bit of preparation for this episode, in that I pulled the rankings from the 1960s that Catherine and I had done. And I should say, actually, I mean, oddly, you know, the last novel that I actually covered with Catherine was, in fact, Halloween Party. And then I know you covered from Cat Among the Pigeons, which technically came out in 1959, to Passenger to Frankfurt in 1970. So Passenger to Frankfurt was the first episode I did with a guest co-host. I did that actually with Sophie Hannah.
Yes,
I remember.
But for the most part, yes, these are episodes that Catherine and I were able to do together. And for that reason, I cherish them. I've never, though, had a reason to look at the novels from the 60s on their own in this way and see exactly how they rank out. So I'd love to just run through from bottom to top how those novels rank, the ones that you have now spent so much time discussing, and just sort of see how you feel about that and whether or not you have major disagreements, quibbles, etc. Let's, you know, just
most of the major disagreements will probably be between me and Gray.
That's great. But as evidenced by the John Curran episode, I welcome, you know, intense disagreements. That's part of the fun here when we're talking rankings. Okay, so I don't think you will be shocked to learn that the bottom ranked novel is Passenger to Frankfurt, or maybe you will be shocked. I mean, I know that
an intake of breath from Gray, not from me.
I know that Passenger to Frankfurt has gotten, for me, a surprising amount of love on your podcast, but which I appreciate. And, you know, Sophie Hannah actually also was quite complimentary to it when we covered it. So that is our bottom ranked. I mean, it is actually our second to last ranked novel overall. I believe John Curran thinks it should be in dead last place, by the way.
It wouldn't be the first thing that John and I have disagreed on. I can't, in all honesty, though, say that all of those disagreements come from my actual opinions versus just my desire to wind him up.
All right, next we have The Clocks, then Third Girl, At Bertram's Hotel, By the Pricking of My Thumbs, Halloween Party, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, A Caribbean Mystery, Cat Among the Pigeons, and then our top two titles, which I think makes a fair amount of sense, are The Pale Horse and finally Endless Night.
It's funny, as you were going through that, I was thinking, well, they're all good books. I want you to do a podcast about those.
Well, and what I would say is, I mean, I was thinking about this, and I think they divide up into two major categories. And I think when Christie was good in the 1960s, she was as good as she ever was. And that is something that I think you have really been, you know, talking about and pushing over the course of your entire podcast. You know, Endless Night is ranked 4th overall. That is just an undisputed Christie gem. The Pale Horse was always much higher in our rankings until we finally were prevailed upon to lower it a bit, because I think it was one of those novels we were extremely high on after we had read it.
Yes. Didn't it break the top 10 at the time?
It did.
I seem to recall.
It did. And really, though, the reason that it's 24th overall is just because numbers 1 through 23 are so superlatively wonderful that it still is an excellent book. Cat Among the Pigeons, A Caribbean Mystery, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. I think those are all excellent Christies, and the fact that The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side is 38th just shows, how that top half, even the top 2/3 of the roster are, wonderful, and what a genius Christie was. Unlike Mae West, I think when Christie was good, she was good. When she was bad, she was not necessarily better. I think sometimes, especially in the 60s, when she was bad, she was worse. These are the titles that I think have major flaws. Halloween Party, By the Pricking of My Thumbs, At Bertram's Hotel, Third Girl, The Clocks, Passenger to Frankfurt. Those are all fairly low, going from 51st to 65th out of our 66 titles. But I know that within that group, there, for example, at Bertram's Hotel, I don't want you to be a Bertrologist?
Bertrologist, yes. I am a proud Bertrologist.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. We're getting that trending, I feel. That's the plan.
It's such a readable novel. It's just really fascinating. The cast of characters in that novel is so strong. It's one of the ones that I think about the, one-off characters more than lots of others, even down to sort of the struck-off doctor and all of these people, and then like the guy who works at the jewelers and all these people. I remember them really well. So as a piece of literature, I actually think it's one of her strongest for me.
Yeah, I'm proud of because we spent a lot of time in our money episode, I think I'm right in saying, digging into the historical context, which, as you know, is a lot of what we do, is mapping what was going on in the world exactly when the first readers were picking up these Christies in the 60s, and what cultural reference points, socio-political reference points they were bringing to their first reading. And I think you mentioned in your All About Agatha episode, but I'd never seen it in great amounts of depth before, the parallels between Bertram's and what went on in the Great Train Robbery.
Sure.
And the more I delved into that, I got quite obsessive looking at all of the details. And the more you see that Christie is popping out these references in that book left, right, and centre, and it does, I think, really enrich the reread of that book. So that in particular does bump it higher for me. I think a contemporary reader would probably look kinder on Bertram's than us in 2024 for that reason.
I think I have an idea to do an episode focused on the ripped from the headline / true crime aspects of Christie's books, because we all know The Mousetrap is based on a real incident. We all know that Murder on the Orient Express is based on the Lindbergh baby, but there's so much more than that. And many people know The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. That's a big controversy, obviously, how much that is based on either Jean Tierney or the Dutch royal family, or nothing. But there's a lot more. I mean, I even just recently learned that The Murder on the Links.
Yes, which is book 3. I mean, that's the third book she publishes. Yeah. And straight out the gate. It's not like, I think sometimes there's a temptation, and this is one of the myth-busting things we try to do on our podcast. There is a temptation to go Christie's woolly and losing it and a bit off the boil in the back half of her career. And I think what comes with that sense of, she started making up drugs, she started relying on headlines when she hadn't done that before. No. From book 3, Murder on the Links, as you say.
That's just something that she did, and I think she did it because it interested her, and she knew it's one of those instinctual things that is why she was the successful genius writer that she is. I think she just knew that taking real life cases and fictionalizing them and having her audience, and not hiding the ball, though. She's never overly clever about it, because why? There's no need to be. I think that's part of the fun, but we lose that because most people now, of course, reading Bertram's Hotel, as you said, they're not going to know that that's a reference to the Great Train Robbery. So I agree. There's that statement of, a contemporary reader versus a reader now. I think almost always a reader within Christie's time, within a year or two of when the book was published, was probably going to have a richer experience for those reasons, because I think all of the books probably are just littered with those sorts of references, many of them lost to us.
Yeah, I was speaking to John Curran the other day about Murder on the Links, where he said, why is it set in France? The only reason it's set in France is because that's where the real life case took place. So that's why, as a reader at the time, you would be like, oh, I know this sort of story. I recognise what's referencing it. Because he's right. Otherwise, there's really no reason for it to be set in France. I remember on my reread, a long time ago reread, because I'd read it as a child, being really surprised it was set in France, because that doesn't seem like at all significant in terms of the way the mystery worked.
I thought maybe it was set in France because Poirot is French.
Oh,
I'm joking.
get out.
It's a running theme of how often we spot.
That was a joke. That was a joke.
Bad adaptations and stuff calling Poirot French.
Yeah, we had great fun in our talk this week in Torquay. We had great fun having a Belgian flag fly in. You know, you can make PowerPoint do all these excellent...
should have had Belgian beers or
yeah, well, we did have beer, but I don't know if it was specifically Belgian.
That's a missed opportunity.
There's at least one that I can think of where in the sort of document clearly the people planning the sort of project thought that Belgium was in France. So they thought it was either a city or a sort of district or state or whatever in France. Yeah,
like Alsace-Lorraine, Belgium.
I wonder if I mean, at some point I was going to mount something of a defense for Passengers Frankfurt, because that's kind of my job. And it's kind of related to what we were just saying about the contemporary reader taking Christie perhaps in a different way to the way we read her now. Dare I say, I thought about this the other day. So Passengers Frankfurt is, as we know, a sort of fantasia, an extravaganza that's very much pessimistic about the future of
humanity.
I was going to say Western society, but
everything.
Everything, yeah, absolutely. And she makes that very clear in that amazing foreword.
Yes.
I wonder if we would look on, and I'm saying this with my tongue firmly in my cheek, I'm wondering if we would look on Passengers Frankfurt more kindly if the world had indeed ended in 1971.
So we couldn't read it?
Exactly. But hear me out. The thing is, you know, so I'm a playwright. I read a lot of plays from the last 20, 30 years to try and get me in the mood when I'm sitting down to write a new script. And particularly in Britain around sort of 2010, 2011, there are so many apocalyptic, society's collapsing, London is burning kind of plays. And they're always really hard to revisit now, because you go, well, 2011 was fine. I mean, you want to talk about 2016, you want to talk about 2020, you want to talk about 2024.
Right.
2011 in retrospect was fine. And actually, I think we talk a lot on the podcast about the Cold War and how important that is, how amazingly Christie was so plugged into that fascinating, turbulent backdrop to so much of her work, almost all of a great chunk of her work. If you take the Cold War beginning from basically the end of the Second World War and finishing after she passed. The trouble is, we look back now and we go, well, we know that the 70s were actually quite a peaceful time for the Cold War. It didn't really ratchet up again until 83. And, you know, when I think, and a lot of people think, that when she's writing Passengers to Frankfurt, a lot of that pessimism comes from things like the student movement, the sort of revolutions, if you like, that were happening, sparking across the world.
The Troubles also.
Yes.
I feel like that's...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the fear that comes hand in hand with seeing rockets launching into space and indeed landing on the moon and just general kind of advancements. But we don't look at those historical events today the way that she was looking at them when writing in 69, when publishing in 70.
Yes.
And I think, I wonder if, I think it does make a difference if you read that forward. I think, which I know you did. In fact, I think you read a lot of it out on the podcast. I remember being really enriched by that. And Jamie Berntal, friend of your podcast, friend of ours,
absolutely loves Passengers.
Who loves Passengers.
He is, yeah.
As does Benedict Morrison, and they're two of the smartest people going in terms of Christie perspective. So, you know, don't listen to them at your peril. But Jamie even made the point in his talk the other day here in Torquay about the supreme importance and how well written that forward is. And I think if you read, I think anyone that reads Passengers to Frankfurt without that is at risk of not fully seeing what she's doing there. That said, there are so many points that both of you have made against it that I don't disagree with. And I know we were talking at breakfast about how you always make the caveat, you and Catherine historically always made the caveat that when we say we don't like this and we're talking about Christie, funnily enough, we are still very much loving Agatha Christie, and
always very from a place of love. No, that's completely true. I mean, it's funny. As you were talking about contextualizing Passenger to Frankfurt properly. I never thought about this, but at the All About Agatha live event, we were talking about And Then There Were None, because there was that this wonderful recent-ish Sarah Phelps adaptation, and how it's an uncharacteristically nihilistic novel, and in a way, Passenger to Frankfurt is like her late novel that is sort of tapping into the same pessimism, because that's also part of the magic of Christie, is that even though she has this sense of cynicism, especially through Miss Marple, so many of these books are ultimately not pessimistic. I wouldn't call them optimistic, but they certainly have a faith in humanity. But those are two books, and one more toward the beginning of her career, one at the end, that really do feel, to the point where this made up drug is maybe not the worst thing in the world, because humanity is such trash. That's kind of the message, the message of the book. To me, she captures that spirit so much more convincingly and effectively And Then There Were None,
of course,
than in Passenger to Frankfurt. But I appreciate that she's doing something similar. And I take that point, that I think within that moment, if I had been reading that in 1970 or 1971, it would have made more sense. Just from a story perspective, it doesn't work as well for me.
As a book, as an experience, it is weak compared to other Agatha Christie's. But the ideas are fascinating because there's so much that she's already started to unpick that we can unpick even further. She's really thinking about the way that bits of society work together. So it's a fascinating one to discuss, and it's, given me great entertainment value over the years, much because of that. But as a book, dead last, certainly for this thing, it seems about right.
Well, yeah, I did. I made my own. We both talked about sort of doing our own ranking before coming here to see yours, and with the interesting thing being how much they differ, and in many ways they don't really. And I will say, despite the fact that I've got this reputation now for being a passengerologist, Frankfurologist.
Yes. Frankfurologist. There you go.
I knew you'd come through. It's still, interestingly enough, I made 2 attempts to make my own personal ranking from 59 to 70. And interestingly enough, it still came last in both of mine. And that's with the caveat that I love it.
Well, I'm so glad that you made your own list, because I was going to force you, because it's all well and good to be like, oh no, but Bertram's Hotel is so great and Passenger Frankfurt is so great. Yes, but this is what we have to do on this episode. You have to make and I will just, I want to make 2 points about each about those 2 novels. I think really what we're saying when we're talking about, you have to read this in context and let's get a sense of the contemporary setting. What that's showing is that the book is not timeless.
Yes.
Right? Whereas And Then There Were None is timeless. And Then There Were None, you don't need to say, you need to get a sense of where we were in 1939 and we were about to go in the war. You don't, because when you read the book, you get it. Like it catapults you through the power of the narrative or whatever the writerly magic is of that book. And Passenger to Frankfurt doesn't do that. So I think sometimes some of these books, when they require that context, I think it really should be perceived as a weakness, even though that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do that, because those texts are still worth the exercise, since obviously we're speaking relatively here. So I agree very much with our ranking that Passenger to Frankfurt should be in last place among these 11 titles. And I will just say, at Bertram's Hotel, I appreciate your enthusiasm for it, but I will just note, when I did my ranking the murderers exercise, where I took all of the murderers from the books, it was really interesting, because I had to create that insane sort of March Madness grid of all of the different murderers, and I did it from memory at first before I checked myself. I obviously did not just go in cold onto the podcast. That would have been terrible. And the one, for the most part though, I remembered all of the murderers correctly, and then this actually made it through to the podcast release, which I'm so embarrassed about. At Bertram's Hotel was the one book where I misremembered the murderer. I said on the episode that Bess Sedgwick was the murderer.
Right.
And that is my fault. I'm becoming a Kempologist right now. I'm apologizing for myself. I think the reason that it was really the sole title is because Elvira is just not that memorable, or somehow the book as a murder mystery is very slight because it feels like such a thrillerish murder mystery. And for a Miss Marple, that to me is just a misfire. It's one of those books where the mishmash of genres just doesn't work. And the fact that I incorrectly remembered the murderer, I just think is telling for how flawed that book is. But perhaps it's, telling in terms of how flawed I am. I don't know.
It's definitely a book that I think gets better with rereading. And I think
we both said that for the podcast, didn't we?
Yeah, it's the one that's, I think both of us, has gone up higher in my estimation since we've been doing it. But what I think the problem is that you might see, it's a Miss Marple, so you're expecting certain things. And there's a bit where you go, well, that's not Agatha Christie's fault. That actually she's written a really interesting novel with some fascinating ideas in it, amazing characters, as I said earlier, and really good twists at the end. The whole thing about Bertram's being this facade, and I just think it's really, really clever. Yeah. But it's not, Body in the Library or stuff like that.
And dare I say that the tense mishmash of genres that you're picking up on, Kemper, is the evocation of the tense mismatch that Bertram's itself represents. I think completely we're all within our rights to say that didn't work for me. Yeah. But I definitely think her intention was valid and interesting there.
Yes.
And it's funny, I also misremembered Bess Sedgwick being the murderer, and I'm inclined to blame you because I probably had just listened to your episode at that point. But Bess Sedgwick is such a fantastic character and she's so vibrant. So I guess you're tempted to remember her because she is so memorable. And I would agree that Elvira is not as memorable, but I think Elvira is an aesthetic, as Elvira is very much, and that plays into our 60s love in hands, our swinging sensibilities, because, the baby doll kind of...
The hair parted in the middle, the curtains of hair. You can see her so clearly. Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, I blame the jelly donut for why Bess Sedgwick is.
It's the exciting finale, though. It's because she gets the big villain escape and, showdown, really.
Yes.
That's why you would think of it. And I think I probably thought the same when I reread it, actually. I think I might have felt the same, that I was expecting it to head in that direction.
And what car does she escape in? But the very car that one of the great train robbers owned famously and was papped driving.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Hey, this man does his research.
Yeah, seriously.
What can I say? Well, because you did Bertram's Hotel on Tia Murder, and we talk all the time, so I already knew what you thought of it. But even after that, I was texting and going, and I'd never thought of that. And it's amazing how you can lift, no matter what we may think of some of these weaker books, you can always find so many fascinating and interesting.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that being said, we're sort of agreed that Passenger to Frankfurt should be in last place. I have The Clocks and Third Girl as my next lowest titles. How do we feel about that?
I think The Clocks is the next lowest is fair because...
Gray's shaking his head right now. Very, very...
Great for a podcast.
I like it, but I think there's a little bit too much of... The perspectives that I guess a lot of that Cold War stuff in that the sort of more spyish, so it just doesn't interest me terribly much. So maybe that's just a personal thing, but I'm not terribly interested in the characters in that as much. But I love the premise. I think that the solution to the premise, that it's sort of deliberately, obfuscating, it works, but it doesn't have that, that was really clever. You just go, I see. That sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
It
can, as a reading experience, it can feel dense. I think either you or Catherine say that there's a point midway through that you were really struggling when reading it for All About Agatha.
It has the dragging piece. Some people hate when I use this phrase, but dragging the marsh.
Yes, yeah.
Which is, I've read a couple of Niall Marsh's. I love Niall Marsh, but it's the saggy middle of a mystery where it's an episodic investigation, where you go from person to person and ask similar questions. And Christie rarely has that problem, but I think this might be one novel where it just feels like a little bit of a slog as we're going from person to person.
I personally found it really diverting, and I think I disagree with you, Mark. I actually think a lot of that ensemble are really brilliantly drawn. And we've spent loads of time on the podcast talking about people like Mrs. Hemming and the woman that reads in the magazine about the happiest days of the school holidays. Dare we bring up that controversy with Michelle Casmer again? Hi, Michelle, if you're listening. If you know, you know. But I do, and this isn't an original observation, and we've made it many times on the podcast, but she's taken, you know, St. Mary Mead, or Christie has taken the country house setup or whatever it may be, and she's extrapolated it out onto Coronation Street, onto a crescent.
Yeah.
And it's clear that that's her intention, because she drew a map, thanks to John Curran. We know that she drew a map in one of her notebooks of the crescent in such a way that looked like half a clock, with the intention of that being reproduced in the book, like how in, I don't know, Ackroyd, you get a picture of a map of the study.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that is clearly her going. And this is one of the reasons why we have such a great time looking at all of the 60s works, because you can see, I feel very strongly, you can see her thinking, what else? You know, what? So I've done that. Oh, what about this time if it was a bit? And she almost always builds on or adds to or develops those tropes that she's explored so thoroughly by this point, having written God knows how many books at that point. I love the clocks, and in my list it is much higher.
So what would be second to last in your list then, Gray?
It was actually Third Girl.
Oh,
okay. I mean, by the way, Third Girl is 55th. The Clocks is 56th in the overall rankings.
Yeah,
so.
but I feel Mark would potentially have put Third Girl higher.
You seem like you come across as really loving.
I really
Third
like
Girl.
Third
We did
Girl.
in our
Podcast,
talk this week. We did talk about basically nothing else bar Third Girl.
I would actually have in the third from bottom. So you've got the Third Girl's third from bottom, right?
Correct.
Right. So I would actually have in that place, I'd have Cat Among the Pigeons.
Really?
I have Cat in third from last as well.
Oh, how funny. We haven't spoken about our ranking. Yeah, because I'm not really convinced by all the jewel stuff, and then lots of that feels like the 1920s stories that I'm not so keen on. Suddenly, obviously relative, but you know, they're not my favourites, and it feels like that is suddenly half the book, with the bits that I, you know, that there's a foreign prince and all or princess and all of this sort of stuff that my brain is just sort of turning down at that point and sort of just trudging along rather than really engaging with it. So
I believe Sophie Hannah has the same thing. I think at one point she said when she comes across jewels in Agatha Christie, she sort of turns away. Or
that's funny, isn't it? Yeah, I wonder if that's like for me a bit of a long-term memory of when I watched Poirot as a kid, and if it was a jewel theft one, you go, oh,
I wanted a murder.
I want a murder.
Exactly. Yeah,
but we get both. I mean,
we do.
It truly is one of those, you know, your mileage varies. I remember being surprised by how much I loved the book upon my reread for the podcast, because I was expecting to have all of those issues with it. And I think I previously did have all those issues. And for whatever reason, it kind of came together. And I just have so much affection for Cat Among the Pigeons, which is quite high. Actually, I mean, 29th.
Yeah. I was surprised when you just read that out. I didn't remember you ranking that. But there's so lovely bits in it. I mean, the teachers are so well drawn. And
I just think it's because it's from 1959. So you don't feel like you have to love it quite as much. It's technically not in the 60s. That's my conspiracy theory.
Right. Or, Kemba, do you like it more because it's not the 60s and you have a 60s bias?
Hey, I do not have a 60s bias on this podcast. I mean,
you have the stats to back it up, I believe.
I do. I mean, this is why this crossover episode is so seamless, because I do think that on All About Agatha generally, we have been touting the fact that I think there is this general perception that Christie crests in, depending on your subjective point of view, either the early 40s, maybe all the way into the 50s, and then goes on a decline in the 60s and then falls off a cliff in the 70s. And it's just not true. I mean, there's, we even graphed it once we had finished everything, and it's more or less a straight line. The line does go, it has a little bit of a decline, but it's a statistically insignificant decline. That's what the statistician who made the graph for me and sent it to me, that's what he told me. And I think it's more that there are good books and then not as good books and not as good. Again, this is my opinion and speaking relatively. And that just happens throughout her career.
Of course.
And including into the 70s. I mean, the one book that I kind of wish that you had just gone 1 year further and discussed Nemesis.
We're looking at each other and laughing because, that was the original plan, actually, because we're only talking about the novels here, but we do actually technically go as far as Harlequin tea set, which is 71. And because we wanted, it felt fitting to end at the point at which she gains her damehood. We talked about it a lot, and we felt at the time that was the last book that felt you could truly mount a rigorous and spirited defense of a 60s aesthetic and preoccupation being overt enough to have stuff to say about it.
Yeah.
I think Nemesis definitely has elements of that, and she would have been thinking about it at least in 69.
Yes.
So there would have been a case for doing it. But it's also, I mean, I think we all agree that it's a fantastic late novel. And I know Jamie Bernthal loves it as well. And I think there's so much to say about it.
Yes.
We would have needed an extra 3 or 4. We had to draw the line somewhere.
Yes, I think it would have dominated it a little bit as well, because
quite possibly
there is so much.
There's so much. I sympathize with that. There's so much with Christie that you do have to draw the line, and it's hard because but it could have fit. I think I'm glad that you feel the same way. Because while I was listening to your podcast, I was thinking to myself, well, if they did Cat Among the Pigeons, like why didn't they do Nemesis? Because it really does fit in there.
That you had one point you really wanted to get in about Ordeal by Innocence, and I think we sort of touch on 450 from Paddington, both of which are late 50s, because obviously 450 from Paddington is adapted in As Murder She Said, no comma, no exclamation mark. I'm contractually obliged to say that. In 61. So we did make it a little elastic. But there are moments of references to Sputniks and Beatniks, and in Nemesis you've got Baby Jane. I think
we have Baby Jane.
Yes,
but yes, like you
maybe
said,
we'll just do a whole 8-part series just about Nemesis. A whole sort of,
I believe it could be done.
Yeah, I
genuinely believe it could be done.
Yeah, if you can do it about a Shakespeare play, I don't see why you can't do it about Nemesis.
Well, and Caroline Derry the other day at the Agatha Christie Festival here in Torquay made some brilliant points about Nemesis.
Yes.
Yeah, which I never really thought about before. It's a book that keeps on giving, that one.
Definitely.
I think it is. It's the last great novel that she wrote.
Yeah.
Because the 70s, I mean, and that's the thing. It's like the 60s, as I think you have borne out on your excellent podcast, has so much to offer. And so does the 70s, because you have Nemesis. And then, of course, we have the quirk of those novels from the vaults that were the last ones to be published. They're obviously not 70s novels per se, even though they were published then. But Nemesis was written then and feels of that time, and is a brilliant novel. Actually, one of my favorites, which I would never have predicted when I was beginning the podcast. Yeah. So it's just not true. She was writing at a high level for her entire career.
That's
just a fact.
Absolutely. We're not gonna disagree on that.
So Third Girl, I mean, I completely understand actually all the reasons why.
And I wouldn't be far off that. I only have it one higher, I think. So I do appreciate it. It's just that thing that is just so fascinating in lots of ways, but it definitely has its flaws.
It's almost the crystallization of everything that we want the Swinging Christies to be, because it is the easiest, frankly, it's the easiest argument to win is Third Girl's properly swinging, isn't it? The other ones you have to mount more of a defense for, but it is just so plugged into contemporary society, and I really don't think she embarrasses herself really at all in it with her attempts to do so.
Well, in the setting, I mean, you made this point on the podcast, but the setting itself, is relevant to the mystery.
Yeah.
The fact that it's the 60s and that being drug-addled is something that is not accepted, but at least much more common than it would have been 10 years before, is why, this murderous plot is able to be carried off as successfully as it is. And it doesn't, and it feels believable. You're right. I think, The Pale Horse actually has a little bit, some more cringy, perhaps an older person who's a little bit out of touch trying to, portray the 60s. But Third Girl, I think, because it's so central to the mystery, and I think whenever anything was central to the mystery, she really did her homework and she made sure that it worked. I agree. I don't think she embarrasses herself whatsoever.
That's interesting. read Pale Horse, because that would be my next. But I think you have that. Well, I know you have that.
That would be fourth lowest.
Yeah.
That is sacrilege.
But you have it much higher, don't you? You have it 24th, did you say?
24th overall, second out of these of these books.
But if you think it's slightly cringy, I mean, probably the reason why I have it low is because I agree with what you just said, and I'm coming at it from this historiography perspective.
Sure.
But go on.
It's that opening scene. The opening scene, I think, is a little... I think it's also the first one. I remember when we were covering it for the podcast, it was the novel, as I started to read it, I was like, oh, okay, we are now officially in quote-unquote late Christie. And there's something a little depressing about that also as a Christie fan, even though I can, of course, always go back and read the other books. There's a little bit of a sense of loss that I get from Pale Horse because it almost demarcates middle from end. So for that, I don't know, it gives me a little bit of a squidgy feeling.
Yeah.
It definitely feels different. It feels like a real change in direction, also in terms of the type of story it is, as well as its observations, which, you know, she's in her 70s now, and so it's pretty exciting, really, and she's to try not quite a new genre for her, because she's done a lot of supernatural-ish stuff in the 20s, but this thing of, I can, for my big novel, try something that I haven't done for a long time or I don't do very often.
Yeah.
Well, and try sort of building off the point you made earlier, where I think in a lot of these books in the 60s, we can see her say, okay, well, I've already done that. What can I do differently, or how can I do it better? And for someone who had gone to the well of, it seems like it's supernatural, but it's not, and had done that so many times and in interesting ways, especially in short stories from the 20s. And then, you know, Dumb Witness has an element of that, which I don't think there's a question that this is the book where it is done the best. Yeah. Because it really seems, I mean, as you're 3/4 of the way through your book, you're like, what is happening here? Like, how is this going to be explained? And she does such a good job of conveying the, you know, the sort of pagan elements of village English life. And it's the best version of that. So you can see her just saying, I'm just going to perfect that thing that I liked to do and have done many times before at this point in my career. Right?
Yeah, completely agree. I think she's deliberately setting out to unsettle, and is, by, like as you say, it's by far the first time in her career that she's done that. But it's almost like the way the world has darkened around her is actually benefiting that book. Again, I'm coming at it from a historical context perspective slightly, but even the fact that, you know, I don't think people, maybe more casual fans or readers today, fully appreciate, and this was something that when Murder is Easy was adapted recently sort of came to the forefront of my mind and the forefront of a lot of discourse. I don't think people today fully appreciate how she did write serial killers, and she did have high body counts, and Pale Horse is a very ruthless book in that regard. That list, the hit list, you know, is actually really chilling when you think about it. And other particularly ruthless titles like Murder is Easy, like And Then There Were None. You know, I think Christie, is important to reiterate how much credit we should be giving Christie for that type of crime storytelling as well.
That's such a good, I mean, comparing The Pale Horse and Murder is Easy, that also shows, I think, just what a high level she was writing at in the 60s, because I think she is doing so many of the same things, right? Using superstition and the supernatural as a red herring, depicting this somewhat creepy village life. I think she does it so much better in The Pale Horse and Murder is Easy. You know, Catherine liked Murder is Easy a lot more. I know there are a lot of big Murder is Easy fans, and I've eased up on it a bit. I'm not a huge Murder is Easy fan, relatively speaking, but yeah, I just think that shows how good it is. So why is it fourth to last?
Just
in your list?
I will use.
Explain yourself.
You can't pick on the newbie. I will use the same defense that you used before, which is that there are just so many superlative ones that they just knock that slightly further down the list for me.
So By the Pricking of My Thumbs, you think is better than The Pale Horse?
I love By the Pricking of My Thumbs.
I do too. Yeah.
Really?
Actually, I think that's a great late achievement that people don't really talk about, because that's right near the end of the 60s.
I feel like I'm always saying there's an underrated one, but of all of them, that might be the most and the most forgotten, because I think people really do forget about it. And I think there may be a little bit of people conflating that with Postern of Fate and assuming, because Postern of Fate...
That happened yesterday. Somebody said... somebody who we met said, oh God, is that the awful one where you just sit there reading it going, just look in the hobby horse?
Yeah.
I was like, no, it's not that one. It's not that one.
Yeah.
They are very close, fairly close together.
They are, but
exactly.
in quality, they vary massively. And I think, we've said many times that she tries to get at this incredible, hideous, terrifying, very, very visual idea of the child behind the fireplace. Christie tries to get at that several times in several manuscripts, and I think you can feel her going, no, it's so galling and it's so gruesome and it's such a good idea that it needs a full book to be honored, to be devoted to it. And I think there's something very sensitive about that. But also, you made the point earlier about the risk of kind of sagging in the middle, which I personally think more Christies do than maybe you do, and I certainly think that's a big problem with crime fiction generally, becoming episodic or it's sort of stalling whilst you're just kind of waiting for the revelation. And Pricking is a great example of a title that doesn't do that, because it cycles through. You've got the opening with the nursing home, you've cycled through Tommy off doing his thing, and you have Tuppence travelling to find the house that she's seen in the picture, and then Tuppence discovers the village, and you almost begin the book again at that point, which is this now a Murder is Easy type? Is this now a St. Mary Me type? Is this a creepy village mystery plot? And then it takes you somewhere very different and very dark and very striking at the end. Yeah. I find that book completely riveting in a way that I love Third Girl, and I think it's very atmospheric, but I wouldn't say that's riveting, and I wouldn't say that for a couple of the others that I put lower.
Yeah, I will. I haven't had this thought until I was just listening to you, but I think that in almost all of the Tommy and Tuppence novels, certainly not in the Partners in Crime collection, but in all the novels except for Postern of Fate, they are separated for much of the novel. That's where she gets a lot of the tension, which is almost in a way kind of sweet, because the tension is this married couple who love each other so much, or they need to get back together. Yeah, Postern of Fate, that is not the case, because they're basically just
pottering around together, endlessly,
looking at books. But I agree. I mean, I do think, and it does have a really satisfying climax.
Very.
Third Girl, I think, is, and I think you even made this point on the podcast, that, for a book that is so squarely set in the 60s and has this contemporary setting, the solution is very traditional. And it's one of those ones where, I mean, it's a costuming solution that is a little hard to swallow. Where it's like, really? That they couldn't see that was the same person? And that it harkens back to Styles or any of those classic books. So I find the solution to Third Girl to be a little disappointing. That's another big demerit. I always think of the
drugs as being the solution, but you're right. It's not. Of course, it's not really. It is the whole thing of the. So yeah, you are right. But I mean, it's sort of sometimes when you read a book and you just sort of just ignore the bits that you're not so.
You can easily ignore that too.
Yeah, and we all do that, and that's that's the joy of this is it's all so brilliantly subjective, and you can mount a defense of any Christie book, which is what makes her so brilliant. I would even be tempted to do one of Postern of Fate, but I shan't do that right now.
I'm curious where Halloween Party falls in your rankings, because it's about middle of the pack.
That was one way in which we very much agree. It's middle of the pack for me.
It's higher for me.
It's higher.
Yeah. So it's second or third for me.
Okay.
Yeah, because yes, there's an obvious number one, I think. But Halloween Party just has an atmosphere all of its own that I just, again, maybe it is because I'm reading it knowing that it's a later Christie that adds to it for me. This whole idea that it's, again, her embracing something a bit new, because she'd been to America and had seen the Halloween sort of revelries there. But I love the characters in that. I love the clue of the water. There's a whole thing about Rowena Drake dropping this vase, and it just seems like, oh, maybe she was shocked by something she saw or whatever, was she distracted? And it's just because she had water all over her that she had to give an explanation for, because she was the killer and she drowned.
Yes, that's a great clue.
I think that is one of my absolute favourites. That for me is alongside, fingernails in the waste paper basket in Body in the Library and stuff.
Or peering at the calendar.
Yes, yes.
Hercule Poirot's Christmas, I think. That's the butler in in Hercule Poirot's Christmas, he's like peering at the calendar. The takeaway, because you think that it has to do with a date, but the takeaway is that he's nearsighted.
That you can't
see very well.
Yeah. So clever and so
such
good.
a clever clue.
But there's all this thing, and I love this sort of slightly, the Poirot's wandering around feeling a bit out of his element too, because he's talking to these young people, but they're all sort of quite nice to him. It's not that they're being aggressive, but he obviously feels on a completely different wavelength. You know, that whole thing which I'm always saying about, but where the two teenagers wonder if someone's a lesbian, and Poirot goes, "You've certainly given me a lot to think about." You know,
that end of chapter.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so, I just love all of that, and it just really works for me. So I've got that, pretty high, second or third. For me. It's Halloween Party.
There is a little bit of, I mean, her depiction of the youngins in that is probably the most hopeful of a depiction that we get in the 60s, because those two, I mean, I love that scene, and I love that we get them actually using the word lesbian in a modern way. But then they end up helping out at the end. I mean, they help save the day, and they're certainly quote unquote good characters, even though they're silly teenage boys. There's a little bit more, I think, of menace in Third Girl,
definitely,
and in some of these other books. And that's what I think people tend to remember, that this was Agatha Christie in her old age railing against the younger generation. But that's as always with Christie, because she wrote so much and wrote so deeply, you can always pull the opposite. And I think Halloween Party is a great example of that. I do have affection for it, and it is one of the few titles that I remember reading as a child, because it did legitimately scare me, because it's a child victim.
Yeah.
I think I read it and I was probably around the same age as Joyce Reynolds, and I was imagining myself, having my head held under in a bucket of water.
It's horrible. So vicious. Yes. That's why I love it.
Yes.
It's so vicious.
I definitely read it 4 or 5 Halloweens on the trot as a teenager. I would sit down and read it, and it's a testament to the atmosphere in the book that it does. I do utterly believe it delivers on that premise. For me, the thing to say sort of highest in its favor is the fact that Chris, and I will write on this or speak on this at some point, but there's something about Christie's kind of sacred natural spaces, follies, or in Halloween Party it's the sunken garden, or in
the
Hollow
of Astarte.
Yes, or in the Hollow it's the mise en scène of the pool, the starkly modernist kind of mise en scène of the pool, the swimming pool. And for me, Halloween Party, with that beautiful garden and the Adonis like young man who turns out to be not as laudable as maybe Poirot is lauding him to begin with, certainly aesthetically. That's her best go at that idea, and I love that. I love that Christie wrote so much that we can track her attempts to get at an idea through multiple books and finally see it kind of really beautifully crystallized.
Well, and there's that climactic scene even, and in a sort of a pagan, an outdoor. I always imagine it as being a little bit like Stonehenge.
Interesting,
but I know it's not Stonehenge, but it's a similar sort of outdoor pagan, arena.
I always think sort of Wicker Man-ish.
And it's interesting that no matter how, as we know, the recent adaptation Haunting in Venice departs in many ways from the source material, but it's still. They still have that kind of space in that it's the kind of roof garden terrace, because we're in, the inner city part of Venice. We've relocated the setting, but it's almost like it's so integral to the plot that you could dismantle the plot for a whole new audience and reassemble it being something completely different, but you need that garden.
Yeah. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out, because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
So this is a very deep cut, but I think I can pinpoint one reason why Cat Among the Pigeons is so high and Halloween Party is not as high, perhaps as you would put it, Mark. Because for me, one of the worst aspects of Halloween Party is the unbelievability of Mrs. Reynolds' reaction to two of her three children. Yeah. Two of her three children are dead. And she's like, well, them's the breaks. Yeah. And I think, and this unfairly, before I started the podcast, I believe it or not, I mean, this is very confessional. I had a sense that in Christie, there was no portrayal of true grief. And that she somehow just managed to get around that. And then, of course, when I started reading them, I was like, no, that's not true. She portrays it convincingly and just enough and just in the right way so that it's not distracting.
Sparse, but it is there.
But it is absolutely there, because if it wasn't there, these books wouldn't work. But Halloween Party is an outlier. It is not there, and it's a problem.
Yes.
And one of the reasons that I really love Cat Among the Pigeons is that relationship between Julia Upjohn and her mother. To me, it really I truly believe that Christie was thinking of herself and Rosalind, even though Rosalind was, of course, fully grown. I mean, her grandson was alive by then, but the idea of this mother who goes traveling and has her own life and gives her daughter space. And her daughter is so much healthier as a result. I mean, this is something that modern parents struggle with very much right now. Perhaps I can relate to it on a personal level, but I think that we see so many other examples of her grappling with that issue in what for me is more of a pejorative way, which is possessive mother love. And how it destroys the child and perhaps also the mother figure. Nemesis is a great example of that. I love that we have a positive portrayal in Cat Among the Pigeons. So that's part of the reason I adore that novel. And on the flip side, part of the reason that Halloween Party just is a seriously flawed novel for me because of that.
That is a great point. I wouldn't have thought to bring that up, but you're absolutely right. And I wouldn't have thought to put those two in I
didn't until just now.
Well, there you go. I will say, though, Leopold is a nuisance.
Yeah.
Are you saying he deserved it?
Kemper, are you trying to get me cancelled off the back of my first appearance on All About Agatha? Come on now, be fair.
Yeah, it's absolutely defensible to have Halloween Party fairly high up, and I'm glad that it's at least middle of the pack for us. I mean, the ones that I have a little bit higher, do we all have Endless Night as number one?
I'm number one for that, yeah.
So I actually made my list. No, don't worry. I actually made my list twice because we've joked on the podcast before, and I'm sure you'll agree, Kemper, that you could just catch any of us in a different mood on a different day, and you've got a different favorite and a different least favorite, and it depends what you've just reread, depends what adaptations you've seen, it depends if you're doing this week as we are doing, what talk you've just seen and how they've just made you feel about a book differently. After this week, I'm going to be much kinder on Cards on the Table because it feels like everyone's banging the Cards on the Table drum this week. But no, so I did it twice, and the first time what came out on top was The Mirror Cracked for me, which is what I've been saying probably since we started the podcast is my favorite. And funnily enough, just before I bumped into you two last night, I was walking back to the hotel last night and I was reviewing my rankings in readiness for this recording. And I genuinely said out loud to myself, you idiot, of course it's Endless Night. I had Endless Night as second, and I think maybe I was trying to be contrary, but what tipped it over for me, so ultimately I do agree with you, Endless Night is the top, of course it is, but what tipped it over the edge for me is I love The Mirror Cracked, but Endless Night is it's got a level of sophistication, not just as a Christie, not just as a thrilling, crimey mystery type book, but as a literary novel, there is so much sophistication in Endless Night. It's kind of the best Mary Westmacott novel that wasn't a Mary Westmacott novel. And The Mirror Cracked is great, but it's not special, perhaps, in the way that I think Endless Night is special.
Yeah. Well, and talk about also a book of its time. I mean, I think there is a timelessness to Endless Night. You don't need much, sort of contextualization. And yet, I think when you also think about all of the psychological horror that was proliferating that time, she was really tapping into it. I mean, I don't think she would have written that book 10 years earlier because she was someone who did absorb the culture around her. And, you know, like all artists was interacting with it and reflecting it and commenting on it. And that's part of for me, the fascination of the novel, how well it fits into that moment.
And and again, I've said this many times before, but as we're talking about Endless Night, I love that thing about that you don't really know what the story is for most of the time.
Yes.
So actually you go, what is this? Is it a supernatural story? Is it a love story?
Yep.
Is it, you know, is there going to be a murder? And that's why I think it's very difficult to adapt, although Gray and I did watch the movie not that long ago and both enjoyed it.
Film,
well, I have always it's slightly falls down at the end, but certainly I remember we got about an hour in and Gray turned to me and said, "Why does no one talk about this film? This is a really good film."
I agree, it's unfairly maligned, and starting by Christie herself. I mean, I think Christie she didn't like that last scene because it's so, but it's kind of doing what happens in the book.
It really is,
right?
Yeah,
it's one of those. It's like that's what you wrote.
Yeah,
you know.
But then I've said this on a recent episode of ours. It's almost like sometimes I think her chronic self-deprecation almost extends out to things she sees reflected back at her in the adaptations. I've worked with writers for many years. I am one. You're one in a different medium. We don't like the fact that we put out what we're thinking and then sometimes it gets shown back to us.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's an element of that. I'm glad you brought that up, Mark, about watching the adaptation, because I actually think maybe the only way I could find to knock it down to second, and the reason why I've acknowledged that I was being an idiot and I've put it back to first, is I would have mounted the argument, is it a problem that you get sort of a third, 2/3 of the way through and you're still not really sure what you're reading or where it's going? And I think what I realized last night as I was talking to myself on the streets of Torquay, and apologies to the residents for that, is that you desperately want to know.
I agree.
You still read. And I think it's actually maybe more of a problem with selling a film or selling a TV version. You know, you get 2/3 of the way through the Marple version and you go, where are we going?
And what, is this a story about Miss Marple being a stalker because she keeps turning up at these poor people's like honeymoon and stuff?
Well, Dark Marple.
Yeah,
it wouldn't be my first episode all about Agatha if I didn't get a reference to Dark Marple Catherine in there.
Well, two things. I mean, walking around and talking to yourself is very much a Christie thing to do, so I don't think you should apologize for that.
Kendra,
And second, I also think it reflects the fact that she had the confidence to write a book that is unclear as to genre until about 3/4 of the way through, I think also reflects the fact that this was, her 60th book at this point. So she could do that because I think people say, well, it's an Agatha Christie book, so I'm going to read it. And I know I'm going to get something crimey or you know, so I think she, in a way, was almost able to rely on, you couldn't have done that book as your second book, certainly, because you haven't established a brand or a reputation. I don't even want to say a brand because she's varied enough. It's not like she was doing one thing, but a reputation for, don't worry, this will all work out and entertain you. And it certainly pays off. So
a benchmark for quality. That's what she's established. And it's funny, we do know what that book would have been like if she'd written it earlier in her career, because of course, if you look at just in terms of the twist, it's Roger Ackroyd.
Yes.
And it's amazing how different those two books are, Endless Night and Roger Ackroyd, basically bookending her career. And for me, Endless Night is was a much more fascinating first read, but especially a much more satisfying reread than Roger Ackroyd for me. Yeah. And that may be controversial, but I actually I haven't really enjoyed any of my rereads of Roger Ackroyd because I'm so hyper aware of where we're going, whereas Endless Night is peeling the onion. It's so psychologically hypnotic almost that you get into the mood of it. You're not just going, oh, that's the bit where the missing 10 minutes is.
Yeah. Just on the movie, also, I'm glad that we're shouting at the movie because we talked about it on the podcast and I was surprised by how much I like the movie as well. And I do think Hayley Mills as Ellie is probably one of the best screen depictions of a Christie character. Like, she inhabits that character. Perfect casting.
Except when she's singing.
Yes, the singing is weird. That is very weird.
Dubbed by someone whose singing voice has got no similarity whatsoever to her speaking voice.
But just the perfect casting for like the naive, innocent, lovely American. Like she's just perfect. And the last thing I wanted to say about Endless Night is that I recently, on a Patreon episode, I covered the French language adaptation of Endless Night, which is in the last batch of the Les Petits Meurtres, Agatha Christie. And I did not like it, actually. I love that show overall. I did not like this last batch as much. And one of the reasons, one of my criticisms of Endless Night specifically is that this last iteration is set in the 70s. So they go out of their way to give them bell bottoms and big hair and all of and it's all done in a bit of a spoofy way, obviously. So they took a novel, though, that is in its way so naturally sort of, steeped in the late 60s/70s. And by virtue of the fact that it's a television episode so that you don't have the same point of view of Mike Rogers, the Mike Rogers character in the episode is barely there. And then once you get your revelation that he did it, it comes off as okay, so that one did it. And it could not be less Endless Night than the book is. And it's just so funny because it actually then also comes across as a very traditional, standard golden age solution. And it just made me think about how skilled she was, again, at sort of reflecting the time in which she lived, which is, again, I know just going to your main thesis, that she was doing everything she did in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s about being a part of the culture and reflecting all those things back. She was doing it as much as, if not more, in the 60s. And I think that book is the perfect example of that. You did mention The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, which I also do want to talk about, because I think that is absolutely one of the top books from the 60s.
Yeah. Well, I think
it's second for me.
Yeah. It's second or third for me.
It's actually fifth for me. And this is where, I too changed my opinion. I think I would love to be able to bump up The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side here, certainly above A Caribbean Mystery.
Yes, I noticed you have
higher.
That quite high. But I think, is that because, sorry, not to take us away from Mirror Cracked, but is that because, in many ways, I think A Caribbean Mystery is the most traditional of the 60s books, in that it looks like a classic Christie and it barks like a classic Christie, and it has all the standard sort of cluing and pacing and tightness as well, which we will say some of the later books, that's where they fall down. So I wonder if it gets boosted a little bit because we feel like, you were saying when you hit the pale horse and you feel like the clouds are gathering, and then something like Caribbean Mystery is a ray of sunshine. I
think that's true. I thank you for putting it that way, because I never thought about it, but I think you're absolutely right. I believe John Kern identifies this as the last true puzzle mystery, a Caribbean mystery. The thing is, relatively speaking, for Christie puzzle mysteries, it's fine. It's not one of her most amazing, but because it's the last, I think you're right. It's hard not to feel strongly about it.
Yes.
Because you know that there are no more standard puzzle mysteries after that. But if I was just going to rank those puzzle mysteries, I don't think there's anything about A Caribbean Mystery that makes me say, oh, this is, a particularly brilliant clue. Halloween Party probably has the best golden age-esque clue of any of these books from the 60s, because I think you're right about that water clue. I mean, that is, you could put that side by side with books from the 30s and 40s in terms of excellent clues.
I'm very fond of Caribbean Mystery, but I won't deny that it's slightly flat in some, the atmosphere. And I know that you pointed out, I think I'm right in saying that when you and Catherine did that episode, that there isn't as much Caribbean atmosphere as you might expect. And it's funny.
Given that she went to Barbados, right?
And it made me think how much I am sure that, I know that I saw the Joan Hickson adaptation before I read the book, and how much of that residual atmosphere of the TV version is obviously in my mind when I'm reading it.
Yes.
So whether that affects the way that I perhaps feel a bit more positively about that, because actually I'd never had a problem with that, but it made me think, next time we read it, I maybe will have a think about
You talked about that on the podcast, how that the scene where Miss Marple goes, and has tea.
Yes.
How you were like, wait, that's not in the book?
Yeah, exactly.
And I totally commiserate with that. I mean, when Catherine and I would have to summarize the novels for an episode, we would be sure to read the book. And for the most part, she actually would do the summaries. and do it then before rewatching the adaptations, because it's so hard.
So easy
to
we were doing that with Mirror Crack's book club this week, and a couple of times we had to say, that is in the book, isn't it? It's
yes,
so
they do become one in your head almost, yeah. I will say, I do think I am a sucker for the Christie clues that are based around what is that person looking at, or are they frozen looking at something? And actually, there's an element of that in the Rowena Drake clue that we've just mentioned.
Yes, you're right.
Because she's startled, but she's not startled. There's the brilliant, and I think this is the highlight of a Caribbean mystery for me, the brilliant red herring with the glass eye and what he's looking at, and the picture, and that chapter that ends the eye, and it's so elliptical and so quintessentially Christie, just gives you a sort of frisson. And obviously that's the pivotal thing in Mirror Cracked, is her frozen look at Madonna and Child. I love those clues.
I think the Halloween party, the reason why it's so brilliant is that it almost has two bits of misdirection built into it, because it's not just that she's getting herself wet and then Christie can describe her as wet and not have broken any rules, because you think, oh, well, she's wet because, we saw her pour water. But it misdirects in that she seems to be startled by something she's seeing in the library, which is where we know that Joyce is killed. So immediately then we're thinking to ourselves, based on what we just saw, well, it can't be her.
Yeah, exactly.
But that is an assumption the reader makes. I mean, just brilliant misdirection.
But same with, we did a book club about the Mirror Cracked from Side to Side the other day, so it's very fresh in our minds. And we were talking about how Marina Gregg's look, again, has so many layers to it, because there's a feeling that she's sort of looking off in her kind of grand actorly way. Obviously, a lot of it is in very sort of Five Little Pigs style, only relayed to us from the party, from different characters' perspectives, and Marple can't be there because she's injured, so it's all refracted through what people are sort of vaguely remembering of, or not vaguely, but they're distracted by the fact that it was a starlet's party.
It's a party,
so they can't, necessarily clearly describe what they saw. But there's the element that she's maybe just queening out in a kind of actorly way. There's the element of what is she looking at, which is kind of part of the story. But then there's also the element of, why is she not listening? What is she thinking about? And then the trick being she is listening. And that's the problem. It's not the fact that she's got a faraway look. It's the fact that she's remembering something because of what she was just said. And we made the point at that book club, or somebody made the point, that it's very filmic, which is so appropriate for Marina Gregg, for that book, for the themes of that book. You feel Christie almost pull out, and you can imagine it's how the adaptations have done it. The dialogue sort of fading in the background, but enough that you can grab what happened.
It's one of those books. I mean, I love everything about, I do love everything about the Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. I did not know until listening to your episode that there was an alternate title of Development Murder, which is, the double entendre of that is just brilliant. That would have been such a great title. But I think the fact that I know that when she originally wrote it, she had not hidden the ball of German measles, and she actually had to remove that, right? Because I think it was Dorothy Olding. She started it and then said, oh no, I hope that this isn't blah, 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 and was immediately able to solve it. It's not fair that I'm judging it for that, because there are probably other books where she had to hide the ball a little bit more, because that is such a balancing act that any mystery author has to do. But it does feel like a little bit of a weaker mystery for that reason.
I said second or third, and I would put it in third behind Halloween Party for exactly that reason. And I know lots of people don't really care about the solvability of it. Yes, Craig's putting his hand up. For me, I just love that thrill of knowing that she's got one over on me, and that I really didn't spot that, and it is very spottable. And I love that when Dorothy Olding spotted it, she was like, maybe it's just me, and she sent it out to editors magazines, and they all went, oh, we love Agatha Christie, and it's lovely to see Miss Marple again. We can't like this because it's so easy solvable, or we've got a lot of pregnant women who perhaps don't want to be scared by this. And even Collins, they had a whole chat about, but Lord Harding sent it to Billy Collins, said, can you double check that I haven't, been extremely lucky in solving this immediately because we don't really want to upset her unnecessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on record not caring actually about that. I'm saying this again to wind him up. Hi, John, if you're listening. I'm the antithesis of John Curran in the sense that I'm really not there for the puzzle at all. Actually, it's kind of not what I'm interested in, which is why I've always found yours and Catherine's conversations about plot credibility and plot mechanics so fascinating, because you really drill into those things that I'm sort of just happy to trust that Christie's doing those, and I'm looking for other things. But I will say, I don't think it's fair. I mean, neither of you have said this, but I think the word cheating has been bandied about in terms of hiding the ball, in terms of what the disease was and all of that. And I definitely don't think that's fair, because you made the point, actually, Mark, this week, that often when the solution is a character is, for example, an actor. Can you tell I'm a fan? That actually what you'll be told up front is, oh, they do something in the theatre, or they're currently in the West End, but you're not necessarily getting the word actor, because as we're all highly trained by you and Catherine now, we're on notice of that word. And I think the obfuscation that she gives you is reasonable.
For me, it's always struck me that there is such an easy fix for it, which is that you say, I wasn't allowed to go and see you, but I snuck out anyway, and that you would interpret, or that she would indicate that she had strict parents or something, and you would think, oh, it's just that they didn't want her to go for that. And that you could reveal later that it wasn't just that, or maybe it wasn't that at all. She wasn't allowed to go because she had German measles.
Arguably, that would be more of a. I'm sure that some readers would say that would be even high. I don't think so.
Yeah, and I thing about that you would assume that if you're not allowed to go because she's a movie star and it's really busy,
and that's where Christie often lies, is in the assumptions that we make with our prejudices.
Exactly. It's because she mentions being ill, but doesn't mention what the disease is, which is what I think is a little hard. And knowing that in the original draft she did, and all she did was take out the name. I agree. I think it's entirely fair as written, as published, but it's just not one of those. I mean, it's funny because I think when, Catherine and I were covering these books, I was in your role. I was the one that didn't care as much about the puzzles, because that isn't how I read them. I've gone on record as I don't read mysteries actively. I really don't try to solve them. I like being shown the solution and marveling over that, or and judging is that well done or not? And I think if you're spending a lot of energy trying to solve it yourself, you can't actually make that analysis, or at least I can't.
I agree.
As well as I try to do. But the best Christies are doing both. Yeah. And it's like, that's why Five Little Pigs, where the clues are such that you get to the end of the book and you're like, that is insane that I didn't see that. How could I have not known? Yeah. But you didn't. And this is just one where it's not, they do it with mirrors is probably an example of another fairly easily solvable one, again, relatively speaking, with Christie. And then actually the novel that we spoke about on All About Agatha, Elephants Can Remember. I remember we talked about this. It's one of the rare ones where it's not fair because someone says, oh, I think they were half sisters.
Oh, don't. And the amount of stick I get from Gray about that.
Wait, that's so funny. You should bring that up, Kemper. What a great way to end, because this is one of our main. So Elephants Can Remember, because you did that book with Mark on Agatha for that year's birthday, I got him a print of the Elephants Can Remember first US edition, but it says Mark always remembers, because Mark has an insanely accurate memory, and it always puts me to shame. He remembers everything. He's incredible. I'm not calling you an elephant. This is a compliment. But partly that was an in-joke, because we always disagree about this, because I have such a bad memory that I would genuinely say, I think they were sisters. Maybe they were twins. Maybe cousins? Maybe they were half sisters. I don't know. I just remember people. Like, that's me. I buy that. But you're like, how would you forget?
But see, even when you just said it, you did use the word twins, which Christie, that would have ruined it. Like the word twins is not mentioned until late in the novel, and it's a little cheap. It's for Christie. It's a little cheap. Plus, using twins anyway is very controversial in a mystery. She's subverting the rules, but that's what she did her whole career. But yes, so perhaps there's an element of that in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. But there's just everything else about that book, the development and Dolly Bantry. It's just the booze at the party. I love it all. So I feel like that is the title that it feels low in this list for me, actually. But yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that it's more about so many of these titles, having to make the tough decisions of keeping them low among, the 11 titles we're considering. It's more about wanting to bump things up rather than keep things down.
Yes, that's true.
That does not come as a surprise.
No. So. But we don't expect you to change your rankings. It's fun. You could tinker forever. Yeah, but then we'll be coming next year and go, actually, we've reappraised this, and Cat Among the Pigeons should be higher after all.
I am going to go away and recap Among the Pigeons. It's always so enlightening to talk to fellow Christie fans about any of these titles. It's kind of amazing that we've just spent a year doing this at this point about obsessed with the 60s. But
well, it's a joy to be able to do this with both of you, because listening to the podcast, I would be interjecting my own comments, but now I'm actually able to do it live and in person with you. And I do just want to mention that, of course, Dr. Mark Aldridge's book.
Yeah,
thank you for the plug. Honestly,
Agatha Christie's Marple. I could have done it at the beginning. If you're still listening, handful of listeners who are still with us. Mark's book, Agatha Christie's Marple, Expert on Wickedness, is out in the UK and out very shortly in the US, and perhaps even available in other formats, in ebook and audio formats. Yeah. It sounds like, for those in the US. But a wonderful book. I mean, I used the Poirot book so much on the podcast. I expect to start using this one. And I just have to mention that the book is dedicated to Catherine Brobeck, which I so appreciated. And it was a beautiful dedication. So thank you for doing it.
It was always going to be. As soon as I knew that I was writing it, I was like, well, I know who's getting the dedication for this.
Yes. I mean, Dark Marple, the originator of the Dark Marple theory, which really holds true. That has become part of I feel like the canon of Christie literary analysis, the meta canon.
What a legacy.
Well, thank you so much, Mark and Gray, for being on here. And I would love to give you an opportunity to talk about what else you're doing with Swinging Christies, if you would like to.
Yeah, I think the big thing is, so we are sort of Christie Time is our umbrella name for the things we do. So the Swinging Christies, the main run of core episodes we dropped over this year. We have lots of bonus episodes to come. So it isn't over by any means.
No, stay subscribed.
Stay subscribed.
We've recorded quite a lot that hasn't been released yet. So yes, there are definitely treats and different types of episodes as well. We're really flexing the format, and I'm excited for people's reaction to some of the things coming up.
You're doing some on location.
We may well have done. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
He says coyly.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that might be my favourite one, actually.
Yes. Yeah. There's one coming up that we both said is our favourite episode to make. So
very special.
And then perhaps moving beyond the 60s, then under the bigger Christie Time umbrella.
We absolutely have a document that has all of our things for what we want to do.
Yes. You have many intentions.
Some of which are NDA locked in fact.
Absolutely.
Being very indiscreet, Kemper.
Yes. So a lot is coming from us.
Yes, but stay tuned, and everything will be on our website, which is christietime.com.
Yes.
And if people want to catch us on X and Instagram, it's Christie_time. You usually do the contact detail shout out, so I'm like, oh God, what are they?
Yes, we'll be posting on them when stuff comes up.
Oh, and if people want to email us, we're at theswingingchristies@gmail.com. Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. And
thank you.
I will be, whatever you put out next, I will be listening. Thank you again to Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown, co-hosts of the Swinging Christies podcast and schemers, masterminds of more Christie hijinks to come. By way of Christie Time, very intrigued by that. Can't wait to see what they have in store for all of us. I hope you enjoyed our wide-ranging discussion. I certainly did. It was so nice to be able to do that at this past year's Agatha Christie Festival, and I so appreciate having them as friends and colleagues, and some of the few people in the world who can talk about Christie for as long as I can and want to. For my next episode, I am going to be doing a Halloween spooktacular episode. It is that time of year, and we still have a few Agatha Christie short stories left to cover, believe it or not, a few of the outliers. Many of those short stories have been covered on the podcast's Patreon account, So unfortunately, they are behind a little bit of a paywall, but only a $5 a month paywall. Feel free to check out that Patreon account by clicking the link in the show notes. For the month of October, there is a companion spooktacular episode all about the ghost stories of M.R. James. Montague Rhodes James wrote some of the very best ghost stories that we have in the English language in the late Victorian and Edwardian period. I am new to him, but I think I brought all the zeal of a convert to my conversation about his ghost stories on this month's Patreon. So if you are intrigued by that, check it out. And if not, have no fear, because there will be yet another spooky story here on the regular podcast by Agatha Christie in 2 weeks' time. And that is going to be The Fourth Man, which was first collected in The Hound of Death, that early collection of mainly spooky, supernatural short stories of Agatha Christie's. And I should note that there is an adaptation of that short story, an hour-long adaptation, which aired as part of the Agatha Christie Hour in the early 80s. I will be watching that adaptation and covering it as well when I discuss the short story. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me personally on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books and at my author website, www.kemperdonovan.com. I've provided links in the notes to all of these various handles and websites, including a link to my second book in the Ghostwriter Mysteries series, which is titled Loose Lips, and it is coming out in late January of next year, so just a few months away here in the US. That is the scheduled release date, and I would really appreciate it if you could pre-order the book. It helps me out greatly. It helps goose the book's profile, and if you're planning on buying the book anyway, it's just one more thing you get to check off of your to-do list a little early. As always, I welcome ratings and or reviews of the podcast wherever you are listening to it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.